Hello, and welcome back to our channel. If you're a history enthusiast or someone who loves diving into the fascinating lives of influential figures, you've come to the right place. Today, we're about to take you on an unforgettable journey through the rise, glory, and eventual fall of one of history's most complex and controversial figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's story is one of ambition, brilliance, and, ultimately, tragedy. A tale that spans from humble beginnings on a small Mediterranean island to the heights of empire. His life, full of dramatic turns, remarkable victories, and inevitable defeats, reshaped Europe and left an indelible mark on the world. From being a young, determined Corsican to becoming Emperor of the French, Napoleon's rise to power is a testament to his genius and ruthless determination. But with all great rises, there comes a fall. And Napoleon's decline is just as fascinating and significant as his rise. Before we jump into the captivating details of Napoleon's extraordinary journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. By subscribing, you'll be joining a community that's passionate about history, learning, and exploring the events and figures that have shaped our world. We love hearing from you. So be sure to leave a comment and share your thoughts with us as we go through this incredible story. What do you think about Napoleon? Hero or tyrant? Let's start a discussion. Now, let's dive into the early years of this legendary figure. Napoleon Bonaparte's story begins on the island of Corsica. Born on the 15th of August 1769, into a family of minor nobility. However, despite the noble title, his family was far from wealthy or prestigious. Corsica, at the time, was a land of political upheaval and unrest, with its inhabitants fiercely protective of their independence. In fact, Corsica had only recently been annexed by France, and the island was still grappling with its new status as part of a foreign nation. This turbulent environment would shape Napoleon from an early age, instilling in him a deep sense of ambition and a desire to rise above his circumstances. As the fourth of 11 children in his family, Napoleon's early life was marked by modest means, yet his parents had high hopes for their children's futures. Though they did not have wealth or power to offer, they recognized the potential in young Napoleon. And it was in these challenging, humble beginnings that Napoleon would begin to forge the path that would lead him to the pinnacle of European power. Despite his family's limited resources, Napoleon's early education in mainland France would set the stage for his later military career. Little did anyone know, the young boy from Corsica, surrounded by conflict and adversity, would go on to change the course of history. With every step, Napoleon would prove that destiny was something to be seized, and that no amount of humble beginnings could stand in the way of a man with enough ambition, talent, and drive. So sit back, relax, and join us as we explore the remarkable journey of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who would rise from the small island of Corsica to become one of the greatest military leaders and emperors in history. Napoleon Bonaparte's life began in the humble and tumultuous setting of Corsica, an island in the Mediterranean that had only recently become a French territory. Born on the 15th of August 1769, Napoleon was the fourth of 11 children in a family of minor nobility, but wealth and prestige were not part of his inheritance. Corsica was a land of conflict and struggle, its inhabitants fiercely protective of their independence, still reeling from the effects of the island's recent annexation by France. Despite this, the young Napoleon would rise from these humble beginnings to become one of history's most extraordinary figures. From an early age, Napoleon stood out. He was not particularly tall, standing at just 5 feet, 7 inches, but his mind was sharp, and his ambition burned with a ferocity that set him apart from his peers. Growing up in a family that valued education but lacked the means to provide it, his parents recognized early on that their son had a unique spark. He was sent to mainland France at the age of 9 to attend a military school in Brienne-le-Château, a decision that would irrevocably change the course of his life. At Brienne, Napoleon was confronted by a world far different from his own. Surrounded by French aristocrats, many of whom came from wealthier, more privileged backgrounds, Napoleon was an outsider. His Corsican accent and humble origins made him an object of ridicule among his peers. Yet, he never allowed this to deter him. Instead, it only fueled his determination to prove himself. While his classmates indulged in the frivolities of youth, Napoleon devoted himself to his studies. He was particularly drawn to military history and the art of war. Napoleon's fascination with tactics and strategy was matched only by his obsession with learning. His mind raced, devouring every book on military theory he could get his hands on. While his peers dabbled in social life, Napoleon focused on perfecting his mind, immersing himself in the works of the great military leaders who had shaped history, leaders like Julius Caesar, Frederick the Great, and Alexander the Great. Despite the challenges he faced, Napoleon quickly rose through the ranks at the academy. His intellectual prowess set him apart from the other students, who were often content to rely on their noble status rather than merit. Napoleon's military acumen, though still in its early stages, was already beginning to shine. He quickly outshone his peers, earning the respect of his instructors and a reputation as a promising young officer. By the age of 16, Napoleon was ready to embark on his military career. He graduated from Brienne and was accepted into the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, where he completed his training as an artillery officer. In 1785, at just 16 years old, Napoleon was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French army. The French Revolution was unfolding in the background, and the country was in a state of upheaval. The old regime had been overthrown, and a new radical government was taking shape. For many of Napoleon's contemporaries, the revolution represented an unpredictable and often dangerous time. However, for Napoleon, the chaos presented an opportunity. The revolution, for all its turbulence, offered an opening for young men like him to rise above their station, regardless of their noble heritage. This was a moment when merit could eclipse birthright, and Napoleon intended to take full advantage. His first major military engagement came in 1793 during the siege of Toulon, a key moment that would begin to solidify his reputation. Toulon, a port city in southern France, had fallen into the hands of royalist forces who were seeking to restore the monarchy. The revolutionary government sent an army to recapture the city, but it was a difficult and bloody task. Napoleon, then a young officer, was given command of the artillery. His strategic thinking and bold decision-making during the siege would become a hallmark of his later career. He recognized that the royalists had fortified the city in a way that made a direct assault nearly impossible. Instead, he proposed a daring plan to place artillery on high ground overlooking the city, where it could bombard the enemy positions from an advantageous angle. The plan worked, and Toulon was retaken, much to the amazement of his superiors. Napoleon's actions at Toulon did not go unnoticed. The revolutionary government recognized his talents, and at just 24 years old, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general, his career officially on the rise. Napoleon's rise was further accelerated by the events of the French Revolution. As the revolution continued to unfold, the political landscape of France was constantly shifting. The country was torn apart by internal divisions, with factions vying for power and control. As a general in the army, Napoleon found himself in the midst of these political upheavals. He was a staunch supporter of the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, even as he navigated the complex and treacherous world of French politics. Napoleon was not a man to shy away from the chaos. He thrived in it. His charisma and clear sense of purpose allowed him to gather a loyal following among his soldiers and colleagues. He inspired in them a deep sense of devotion, and soon his name was whispered in the same breath as the most celebrated leaders of the time. But despite his growing influence, Napoleon remained focused on a singular goal: to leave a legacy that would endure far beyond his time. It was clear to him that in order to achieve that, he would need to rise above the petty politics of the revolution and chart his own path. He began to understand that his talents could not be confined to the battlefield alone. He would need to manipulate the political forces at play, aligning himself with the right people at the right time, while remaining true to his ambition. Napoleon's focus was unyielding, and while many around him faltered in the chaos, he kept his eyes on the prize. He would not simply be a general, he would be the master of France. The success at Toulon was a crucial turning point. It marked the moment when Napoleon's name began to echo through the halls of power. As he rose through the ranks, he gained the trust of the revolutionary government, and by the late 1792, he was entrusted with increasingly important military commands. Yet his meteoric rise was not without its challenges. Napoleon was constantly being pulled between the forces of radical revolutionaries and the conservative factions who feared the changes that the revolution was bringing about. Despite the political instability, Napoleon's loyalty to the principles of the revolution never wavered. But he was no idealist. He understood that if he wanted to leave a lasting imprint on history, he would need more than just military victories. He would need to manipulate the political landscape to bend it to his will. It was during this time, amidst the growing chaos of the revolution, that Napoleon began to think more seriously about the future. His rapid rise had shown him the fragility of power. No one, not even the revolutionaries, was safe from the shifting tides of history. Napoleon realized that if he was to truly shape the future, he would need to rise above mere circumstances and take control of his destiny. The events of Toulon, however, were not merely a moment of military triumph. They were the beginning of something much larger. Napoleon had tasted true power, and from that moment on, he would stop at nothing to ensure that he would never be ordinary. This was a man who understood that history was written not by those who played by the rules, but by those who had the courage to rewrite them. Napoleon Bonaparte had begun his ascent, and the world would soon learn the name of the man who would change the course of history. As the revolution continued to evolve, and as France teetered on the edge of collapse, Napoleon remained a figure of unshakable purpose. While his contemporaries wrestled with the forces of chaos, Napoleon saw a clear path forward. He had no illusions about the cost of ambition, but he was willing to pay it. His early victories and unrelenting drive had already set him on the path to greatness, and now, with each step he took, he moved closer to his ultimate goal: to carve out an empire that would endure through the ages. Little did the world know, the name Napoleon Bonaparte would soon be spoken in awe and fear. forever altering the destiny of Europe and the world. The year was 1789, and France stood at the precipice of an era-defining transformation. The French Revolution was in full swing, an upheaval that shattered centuries of tradition and radically altered the country's political landscape. The old order was crumbling, and with it, the social structures that had long kept the people divided and powerless. Amidst this chaos, Napoleon Bonaparte, a young, relatively unknown officer, found himself thrust into a world of revolution, upheaval, and, most importantly, opportunity. At the time, Napoleon was just beginning to come into his own. He was not yet the towering figure he would become, but he was determined to carve a path through the storm. The revolution had thrown France into turmoil, with the monarchy overthrown and new, radical ideals rising to prominence. It was a time of great instability, but for Napoleon, it was a moment that seemed ripe for personal advancement. The revolutionary winds were sweeping across Europe, tearing down old power structures and offering young, ambitious men like Napoleon the chance to rise above their humble origins. He understood that this was no ordinary moment in history, and he was determined to be part of it. Napoleon's military career began in the midst of this storm, and he quickly demonstrated that he had the qualities needed to navigate such a tumultuous time. Although young, Napoleon's ambition burned brightly, and his mind was razor sharp. His first true test came in 1793 during the siege of Toulon, a pivotal moment in his early career. Toulon, a port city on the southern coast of France, had fallen into the hands of royalist forces who were seeking to restore the monarchy. The revolutionary government, desperate to retake the city, tasked the French army with its recapture. Napoleon, still a relatively untested officer at the time, was given command of the artillery. While many questioned his experience and abilities, Napoleon saw an opportunity to prove his worth. With the city firmly entrenched in the hands of the enemy, the challenge seemed insurmountable. The royalists had fortified their positions well, and the siege seemed poised to drag on indefinitely. But Napoleon, as always, saw a different approach. Rather than relying on brute force or traditional tactics, he employed an innovative use of artillery that would prove decisive. By positioning his cannons on high ground, he was able to fire on the royalist positions from an unexpected angle, effectively neutralizing their artillery and breaking their stronghold. The royalists were forced to surrender, and Toulon was reclaimed by the revolutionary forces. The success at Toulon catapulted Napoleon into the public eye. At just 24 years old, he had demonstrated a level of military brilliance that was far beyond his years. His use of artillery in such a bold and unconventional manner was hailed as a stroke of genius. The victory earned him the admiration of his superiors, and his promotion to brigadier general was swift. Toulon was a turning point for Napoleon, a moment when he had proven not only his tactical prowess, but also his ability to inspire and lead. It was clear that Napoleon had the potential to rise far beyond the rank of a mere officer. As the revolution continued to unfold, Napoleon's rise seemed inevitable. France was a nation in flux, and with the old power structures collapsing, there was space for a new kind of leader, one who could bring order to chaos. Napoleon, ever aware of the moment, seized this opportunity with both hands. His reputation spread rapidly, and by 1796, at the age of 26, he was entrusted with the command of the French army in Italy. This was no small feat. Italy was a land divided, and the French army had been sent to wrest control from the Austrians and their allies. It was a delicate mission, fraught with difficulty and danger. But for Napoleon, it was the perfect stage to prove his worth on a grand scale. Napoleon's campaign in Italy was transformative, not only for him but for the very course of history. It was here that he would first show the full extent of his strategic genius. He approached warfare with a mind that seemed to see the battlefield differently from others. Where others saw obstacles, he saw opportunities. His brilliance lay in his ability to read his enemies and adapt his strategies on the fly. He understood that war was not simply about brute strength. It was about strategy, timing, and the ability to outthink the opposition. In Italy, Napoleon applied these principles with a ruthlessness that left his enemies bewildered and his soldiers inspired. He orchestrated a series of rapid, decisive victories, which not only secured his legend as a formidable military leader, but also reshaped the map of Europe. His victories at battles such as Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli demonstrated his knack for turning the tide of battle in his favor, often against overwhelming odds. These triumphs were not just military successes, they were also political maneuvers that bolstered his standing back in France. Napoleon understood the power of propaganda and used his victories to enhance his image as a heroic figure, a savior of the Republic. His dispatches were filled with tales of valor and glory, captivating the French public and securing his place as a national hero. As he marched through Italy, he also enacted sweeping reforms, reorganizing governments, and introducing the principles of the French Revolution. His influence extended beyond the battlefield, leaving a lasting impact on the regions he conquered. By the end of his Italian campaign, Napoleon was not just a general, he was a symbol of change, embodying the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Napoleon's successes in Italy set the stage for his future ambitions. They provided him with the wealth, fame, and political capital necessary to ascend to even greater heights. Little did the world know that this young Corsican artillery officer would soon become the Emperor of the French, reshaping Europe in his image and leaving an indelible mark on history. The French army was, at the time, exhausted and demoralized. They had suffered several setbacks, and morale was at an all-time low. Yet, under Napoleon's command, the soldiers were revitalized. He inspired a sense of unity and purpose among the ranks. Where there had once been uncertainty, there was now a fierce determination. Napoleon knew how to rally his men, how to make them believe in his vision. He didn't just lead them, he made them feel as though they were part of something larger than themselves. His charisma was undeniable, and it was this that allowed him to unite the disparate forces of the French army and lead them to victory after victory. Napoleon's campaign in Italy unfolded in a series of brilliant military maneuvers. In the Battle of Lodi, for example, he successfully led his troops across a narrow bridge under heavy fire, a bold and risky move that paid off in spades. Each victory seemed to build upon the last, creating a momentum that swept through the French army. Napoleon's ability to anticipate his enemy's moves, to strike with precision and speed, was unmatched. His victories in Italy turned the tide of the war, and soon the French were on the offensive. With each victory, Napoleon's reputation grew. The people of France began to take notice, and soon his name became synonymous with military genius. He wasn't just winning battles, he was reshaping the way war was fought. His tactics were studied and admired by military leaders across Europe, and his successes were seen as a symbol of the power and ambition of the new France. But while Napoleon reveled in the glory of his victories, he never lost sight of his ultimate goal. He wasn't fighting just for territory. He was fighting for the ideals of the revolution. He wanted to bring the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity to the rest of Europe, and he saw his conquests as the means to achieve that vision. Napoleon's charisma and military prowess were key to his rise, but his ambitions extended far beyond the battlefield. He saw the French army not only as a force to be reckoned with, but as the instrument of a greater vision. His conquests were not just about expanding French territory, they were about spreading revolutionary ideals across the continent. To Napoleon, the French Revolution was a call to arms not just for France, but for all of Europe. He believed that he had been chosen to lead this charge, to bring about a new order that would reshape the face of Europe. His victories in Italy solidified his status as a national hero, but they also set the stage for his larger ambitions. As his reputation grew, so did his ambition. Napoleon understood that his success in Italy was only the beginning. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but he was undeterred. He had already proven that he could lead, that he could inspire, and that he could win. His victories in Italy were only the first step toward the grander vision he held for himself and for France. Napoleon's name had become synonymous with triumph, and as he returned to France in 1797, he was greeted as a hero. But for Napoleon, the real battle was just beginning. His future was not yet written, and the opportunities ahead would be vast and full of promise. In the years to come, Napoleon would face greater challenges and more dangerous enemies. But the campaign in Italy had laid the foundation for everything that would come after. His rise from a young, relatively unknown officer to the leader of the French army in Italy was nothing short of meteoric. It was a testament to his ambition, his strategic genius, and his unyielding desire to carve out a legacy that would endure through the ages. As he stood on the cusp of greatness, Napoleon Bonaparte knew that he was destined for more than just military victories. He was destined to reshape the world. Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign in Italy was the defining moment that would shape his career and his legacy as one of history's greatest military minds. The French army that he inherited in 1796 was far from a well-oiled machine. It was demoralized, disorganized, and ill-equipped, the remnants of an army battered by previous defeats and a lack of resources. France, at the time, was embroiled in the chaos of the revolution. Its military stretched thin across multiple fronts. The prospects of victory seemed distant, yet Napoleon, then just 26 years old, was determined to turn this seemingly impossible situation into an opportunity. For him, Italy would become his proving ground, a place where his tactical brilliance would unfold in front of the world. From the moment Napoleon took command, he was acutely aware of the state of the army. It was underfunded, its soldiers hungry, and its leadership in disarray. But what the French army lacked in resources, Napoleon made up for in leadership. Where others saw a fractured, broken force, Napoleon saw a chance to reshape history. He understood that victory in Italy would not come from mere brute strength or an overwhelming advantage in numbers. It would come from strategy, discipline, and the ability to inspire. He instilled a sense of purpose and unity among his troops, motivating them with promises of glory and the spoils of victory. His charismatic leadership and innovative tactics breathed new life into the weary soldiers. who soon began to believe in the possibility of triumph under his command. Napoleon's approach was revolutionary. He emphasized mobility and speed, striking with precision to keep the enemy off balance. His ability to read the battlefield and adapt to changing circumstances became his hallmark. At battles such as Montenotte, Lodi, and Rivoli, he demonstrated his tactical genius, outmaneuvering larger and better supplied forces with a smaller, more agile army. As the campaign progressed, Napoleon's successes in Italy became legendary. His victories not only secured French dominance in the region, but also brought him immense fame and admiration back home. The young general was celebrated as a hero, and his exploits were chronicled in newspapers throughout Europe, inspiring both awe and trepidation among his adversaries. With each victory, Napoleon's confidence grew, as did his ambitions. He became not just a military leader, but a symbol of the new order emerging from the ashes of revolutionary France. His vision extended beyond the battlefield. He dreamed of a unified Europe under French influence, driven by the ideals of the Enlightenment and the revolutionary spirit. Napoleon's Italian campaign marked the beginning of his meteoric rise, setting the stage for his eventual ascendancy to the role of emperor. It was a testament to his extraordinary abilities and a prelude to the profound impact he would have on the course of history. The world watched as a new era unfolded, with Napoleon Bonaparte at its helm, reshaping not only the map of Europe, but also the very nature of leadership and ambition. Napoleon's approach to warfare was far more innovative than anything his contemporaries could have anticipated. His first moves were to reorganize and refocus his forces. He inspired discipline among his men, and in doing so, he instilled a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the troops, weary from years of war and disillusionment, needed more than just orders. They needed leadership that would make them feel invincible. Napoleon, ever charismatic, did exactly that. His presence on the battlefield was magnetic. He wasn't just a general giving commands from the rear. He was a leader who led by example, who placed himself on the front lines alongside his men, enduring the same hardships and dangers. This leadership fostered a profound loyalty among his soldiers, and it transformed them from a disheartened group of men into a tightly knit force united by Napoleon's vision. As he advanced through Italy, Napoleon's strategic genius began to shine through. His first major success came in the Battle of Montenotte, where he decisively defeated the Austrian forces despite being outnumbered. This victory set the tone for the rest of the campaign, with Napoleon utilizing fast, aggressive tactics that caught the enemy off guard. He was known for his ability to outmaneuver opponents, to strike swiftly and decisively. His tactics were a revolution in themselves. Napoleon didn't simply seek to defeat his enemies. He aimed to destroy their will to fight by rendering their positions irrelevant before they could even react. He broke the traditional patterns of warfare, moving quickly and unpredictably, keeping his adversaries on the back foot at all times. The success of the campaign wasn't solely due to Napoleon's battlefield prowess. It was also his understanding of the broader strategic picture. He saw the Italian campaign not just as a military effort, but as an opportunity to weaken Austria's grip on Europe and to expand French influence. With each victory, he not only pushed the Austrian forces out of Italy, but also captured key territories in northern Italy, including Lombardy, Piedmont, and Milan. These territories were rich in resources and strategically important, and Napoleon's victories in these regions significantly altered the balance of power in Europe. His rapid success in Italy sparked fear and admiration across the continent, establishing him as a force to be reckoned with. Napoleon's victories did not stop at military conquest. His understanding of diplomacy played a crucial role in his success. After decisively defeating the Austrian army, he entered negotiations with the Austrians, securing a peace treaty that ended the war in Italy. The Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in 1797, was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Not only did it secure French control of the territories Napoleon had conquered, but it also stripped Austria of key regions, cementing French dominance in northern Italy. Napoleon's skillful diplomacy ensured that his military victories were not just temporary gains, but long-lasting shifts in the European order. Yet, it wasn't just the political and military accomplishments that made Napoleon's campaign in Italy so remarkable, it was also the way he governed the territories he conquered. While many leaders would have focused solely on military victory, Napoleon understood that to maintain control over the regions he had won, he needed to implement reforms that would secure the loyalty of the local population. In every city he conquered, Napoleon worked to establish a stable government and ensure that the French principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity were promoted. Napoleon's reforms were far-reaching. He introduced the French legal code, which aimed to streamline and modernize the legal systems of the Italian states. He also worked to improve infrastructure, building roads, bridges, and canals to improve transportation and communication throughout the region. Education was another area of focus. Napoleon sought to introduce a modern educational system that would train the next generation of leaders, engineers, and soldiers. These reforms were not merely political tools, they were part of Napoleon's larger vision to transform Europe, to create a new world order built on French revolutionary ideals. This approach was not universally popular, of course. There were many who resisted French rule, particularly among the local aristocracy, and those who had lost power in the wake of Napoleon's conquests. But even among those who opposed him, Napoleon's administrative skills earned him respect. His policies of modernization and his ability to bring order to the chaos of war-torn Italy were notable achievements. In many ways, the Italian cities flourished under French governance. They became centers of culture and learning, institutions of modernity in a continent that was still struggling with the remnants of feudalism. Napoleon's strategic brilliance was not just confined to military tactics, it extended to the art of leadership. His ability to inspire loyalty among his soldiers and his people was one of his greatest strengths. His charisma was legendary, and his presence on the battlefield was a powerful force in itself. Napoleon's troops followed him not out of fear, but because they genuinely believed in his leadership. They trusted him, not only because of his military genius, but because he had shown himself to be one of them. Napoleon, who had risen from humble beginnings, was seen as a symbol of the new France, a country that had been born from revolution and was now rising to power on the world stage. Napoleon's leadership in Italy forged an unbreakable bond between him and his soldiers. The trust and camaraderie they shared were unmatched. Soldiers who had once marched reluctantly, burdened by the weight of endless campaigns and defeats, now marched with purpose. They believed in Napoleon's vision, and they knew that under his leadership, victory was not just a possibility, it was an inevitability. This unity was reflected in the cohesion of his army, which became not just a force of military power, but a symbol of shared ambition and hope. By the time Napoleon returned to France in 1797, he was hailed as a national hero. The Italian campaign had not only reshaped the political landscape of Europe, but had set the stage for his rise to even greater heights. The territories he had conquered were now part of France, and his reputation as a brilliant tactician and statesman had spread far beyond France's borders. His return was met with adulation and awe. Napoleon had not only succeeded in Italy, but he had done so in a way that made him seem invincible. Yet, Napoleon's thoughts were already turning toward the future. His vision extended beyond the battlefield, and he knew that his ultimate ambition lay not just in military conquest, but in transforming France itself. The Italian campaign had proven to him that he could change the course of history, that he had the power to reshape the world. But it had also shown him the limits of his current position. Napoleon knew that to secure his place in history, he would need to rise higher, to seize control of not just the French military, but the French state itself. As he began to contemplate his next move, Napoleon was aware of the challenges that lay ahead. But for now, he could bask in the glory of his successes in Italy. The campaign had been a triumph on every front, a testament to his genius as both a military commander and a leader of men. It had cemented his place as one of the most formidable figures in Europe, and as he returned to Paris, he was poised to embark on the next phase of his meteoric rise. His successes in Italy had set the stage for the future, and Napoleon was ready to seize whatever opportunities lay ahead, determined to continue his ascent toward greatness. In 1798, with Europe embroiled in conflict and the French Revolution continuing to reshape the continent, Napoleon Bonaparte embarked on an ambitious venture that would extend his reach far beyond the battlefields of Europe. His eyes were set on the East, where he believed French influence could be solidified, particularly in Egypt, which held a strategic position in the Mediterranean and was critical to weakening Britain's power in India. Napoleon's campaign to Egypt was both a military and intellectual odyssey, one that would challenge his leadership, expose him to unexpected setbacks, and ultimately reshape his own understanding of the world. From the outset, the campaign seemed destined for greatness. Napoleon's forces, though not without their struggles, defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids in July 1798. The Mamluks were formidable foes, but Napoleon's troops, well trained and energized by his leadership, overwhelmed them. As the French army swept through Egypt, victory seemed assured, and Napoleon, ever the visionary, began to imagine a new French empire in the East, with himself at the helm of a new world order. The triumph at the pyramids was a moment of glory for Napoleon, a shining beacon in the early days of the campaign, which energized both his troops and the public. To the French people, Napoleon seemed invincible, a conqueror destined to bring the world under the banner of France. Yet, even as Napoleon basked in the glow of this early victory, darker clouds were gathering on the horizon. Egypt, while rich in history and culture, presented unforeseen challenges that would prove far more difficult than anything Napoleon had encountered in Europe. First and foremost, the vast and unforgiving desert began to take its toll on his army. The soldiers, despite their strength and discipline, were unprepared for the searing heat, the endless stretches of arid land, and the diseases that thrived in the sweltering climate. The logistical nightmare of supplying his forces in such a remote and inhospitable environment soon became apparent. The French army's supply lines were stretched thin, and it wasn't long before food, water, and medical supplies began to dwindle. The strain on the troops was evident, and Napoleon, though ever charismatic and determined, could not escape the relentless pressure that came with such an undertaking. Compounding these difficulties was the destruction of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile in August 1798. While Napoleon's army had achieved a remarkable victory on land, the French fleet, commanded by Admiral François-Paul Brueys, was decimated by the British Royal Navy under the command of Horatio Nelson. The loss of the fleet was a devastating blow to Napoleon's ambitions in Egypt. Without control of the sea, Napoleon was essentially cut off from France, with no hope of reinforcements or escape. The British, with their naval superiority, now had the ability to prevent Napoleon's supply lines from functioning, and his position in Egypt grew increasingly precarious. Napoleon, a man who had been accustomed to victories and triumphs, found himself suddenly confronted with an adversary that he could not easily overcome. Despite these setbacks, Napoleon refused to give in to despair. His ability to maintain control over his forces during these difficult times was a testament to his unyielding will and charisma. He continued to inspire his soldiers with speeches that lifted their spirits, reminding them of their purpose and their duty. Even in the face of mounting challenges, he remained a figure of strength, resolute in his desire to complete the mission. He spent his days leading from the front, showing a determination to share in the hardships of his men. He encouraged them with visions of victory and glory, knowing that his personal influence was one of the few things that could sustain morale. His leadership, in part, was what kept the French army intact, even as it struggled against the forces of nature and the British blockade. As the campaign wore on, Napoleon's time in Egypt became more than just a military endeavor. It became an intellectual pursuit. He had long been fascinated by the ancient world, and Egypt, with its pyramids, temples, and monuments, seemed like the ultimate treasure trove for a man of his ambition. Napoleon, ever the polymath, took the time to delve into the wonders of Egyptology, bringing with him a team of scientists, scholars, and artists whose task was to study and document the land's rich history. The result was a wealth of knowledge that would later ignite a fascination with ancient Egypt across Europe. Napoleon, in his pursuit of military glory, had inadvertently ignited an intellectual revolution. The team of scholars, led by prominent figures such as the mathematician Jean-François Champollion, meticulously cataloged Egypt's ancient treasures. They uncovered remarkable artifacts, some of which would go on to become world-renowned symbols of ancient civilization. The most famous of these discoveries was the Rosetta Stone, which would later become the key to unlocking the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphs. This discovery would prove crucial in the study of ancient languages, opening a window into a civilization that had been shrouded in mystery for centuries. Napoleon's expedition had unknowingly set the stage for a revolution in historical and linguistic understanding, sparking a wave of Egyptomania across Europe. Despite the intellectual and cultural treasures that the campaign produced, the military side of the Egyptian expedition was beginning to unravel. The French, cut off from Europe and beset by logistical problems, were forced to contend with the hostile desert environment, the relentless British blockade, and the ever-growing realization that their position in Egypt was untenable. Napoleon, ever resourceful, tried to rally his forces with promises of future success. But the reality of the situation began to set in. His army was exhausted, and with no naval support, it became clear that the French presence in Egypt could not last. As the Egyptian campaign faltered, Napoleon made the difficult decision to return to France. His once unassailable position had been weakened, and he could see that the political situation in France was growing increasingly volatile. But even in the face of failure, Napoleon was determined to turn the situation to his advantage. He understood that his return to France had to be swift and decisive, for his political future was uncertain. The Egyptian campaign, despite its cultural triumphs, had been a military failure, and Napoleon knew that he needed to regain the trust of the French people and restore his reputation. Upon his return to France in 1799, Napoleon found the country in turmoil. The revolution had left France in a state of constant upheaval, and the political situation was dire. The Directory, the ruling government, was weak and discredited, unable to control the growing chaos. Political factions were fighting for control, and the French people were weary of constant instability. The moment Napoleon had been waiting for had arrived. With his reputation as a military hero still intact, he quickly moved to capitalize on the disarray. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, orchestrated a coup in November 1799, overthrowing the Directory and establishing the consulate. He was appointed first consul, a position that granted him near dictatorial powers. This was the moment that Napoleon had long desired, the moment when he would seize control of France and begin to implement the vision that had been brewing in his mind for years. His ambitions had not been quenched by the failure in Egypt. Rather, they had been stoked by the realization that true power lay not just in military conquest, but in the ability to reshape society from within. While Napoleon solidified his political power, the cultural and scientific treasures brought back from Egypt began to take on a life of their own. The discoveries of the expedition sparked a wave of enthusiasm across Europe, fueling an intellectual renaissance that spread beyond the realm of military conquest. The Rosetta Stone, along with the other artifacts and writings uncovered by Napoleon's scholars, became symbols of the pursuit of knowledge. The fascination with ancient Egypt permeated art, architecture, and literature, inspiring generations of artists and thinkers to explore the mysteries of the ancient world. Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, though ultimately a military failure, had sparked a cultural and intellectual movement that would resonate for years to come. It had introduced the world to the wonders of Egypt's past, while also showing that Napoleon was a leader whose ambitions went beyond the battlefield. He was not only a conqueror, but a patron of science and culture, a man whose vision extended to reshaping the very fabric of society. Even as France grappled with political chaos and instability, Napoleon's star continued to rise, setting the stage for a new era that would alter the course of European history. In the end, the Egyptian campaign illustrated the complexities of Napoleon's legacy, a man who was both a brilliant military tactician and a visionary leader, capable of inspiring awe with his conquests and igniting a renaissance in the world of learning and culture. It was a reminder that, while his ambitions often led to military victories and political upheaval, they also sparked profound shifts in human knowledge, shaping the future in ways that went beyond mere territory and power. The year was 1799, and France, having endured years of tumultuous revolution, was in a state of deep disarray. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that had sparked the revolution had given birth to a government, a new, radical republic. But the dream of a stable and prosperous France was slipping through its fingers. The Directory, the ruling body that emerged from the ashes of the monarchy, was weak and ineffective. Political factions fought for dominance. The economy was in ruins, and the nation was exhausted by constant upheaval. Revolutionaries turned against one another, and the people, once full of hope, were now weary, desperate for a strong leader who could restore order and stability to their fractured land. In this chaos, Napoleon Bonaparte, a figure already renowned for his military brilliance, saw his moment. Napoleon had returned from Egypt in 1799, his military career having suffered setbacks, but his personal ambition and reputation intact. He was deeply aware of the crumbling state of the French government, and more importantly, he understood that the time had come to take control. France needed a savior, someone who could offer a new vision, someone who could bring not only military victories but also an end to the political paralysis that had gripped the country for so long. Napoleon knew that this was his moment to seize power. With his popularity among the military and a growing following among the people, he had the influence and the charisma to make things happen. Through a calculated and daring move, Napoleon orchestrated a coup d'état on the 9th of November 1799. As the Directory faltered, Napoleon, with the help of his loyal allies, forced the government to dissolve. This was no ordinary power grab, it was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. Napoleon knew that to consolidate his control, he would need not only to win the support of the people, but to solidify his position with the military. His appeal to the public was straightforward. He promised stability, he promised order, and most importantly, he promised an end to the chaos that had plagued the revolution. With his return from Egypt, he was a hero, a symbol of French strength and resilience. The people, desperate for a change, eagerly embraced him. Napoleon's rise to power was as swift as it was strategic. He assumed the title of First Consul, a position that granted him near total authority over France. This title was a calculated compromise. While it gave Napoleon absolute control, it also allowed him to maintain the appearance of a republican government, a critical move in a nation still steeped in revolutionary ideals. But Napoleon was no idealist. He understood that to secure his grip on power, he would need to do more than simply overthrow a weak government. He would need to reform France and create a new order, one that would give him both the loyalty of the people and the backing of the military. In his new position, Napoleon wasted no time. He immediately set about stabilizing the economy, which had been ravaged by years of instability and warfare. He reformed the tax system, established the Bank of France, and implemented a series of economic policies designed to strengthen the nation's financial position. The French people, exhausted from years of economic hardship, quickly felt the effects of Napoleon's reforms. Trade flourished, inflation was curbed, and the country began to feel a renewed sense of hope. The chaotic, revolutionary period that had left the people hungry and disillusioned now seemed to be giving way to a more orderly and prosperous future. Napoleon understood that economic stability would be the foundation of his power, and so he worked tirelessly to restore France's financial standing. Napoleon's reforms didn't stop there. He turned his attention to the government itself. One of his first acts was to centralize authority in the hands of the state. The chaos of the revolution had left the nation's administration fragmented, and Napoleon knew that only by streamlining the bureaucracy could he bring true stability. He introduced a new legal code, the Napoleonic Code, that would become the foundation of law in France and many other countries. It was a modern, systematic approach to law, emphasizing equality before the law, the protection of property, and the sanctity of contracts. The code was one of Napoleon's most enduring legacies, and it would influence legal systems across the globe for generations to come. But Napoleon's ambitions didn't stop at merely restoring order in France. His vision was far grander. He sought to create an empire that would stretch across Europe, one that would be governed by French principles and under his command. This wasn't a dream born of mere conquest, it was a vision of spreading revolutionary ideals across the continent, ensuring that the values of the French Revolution would take root in the rest of Europe. For Napoleon, the revolution wasn't just about France, it was about reshaping the world. He had no intention of limiting his rule to the borders of his country. France was only the beginning. His ambition, which had been honed on the battlefields of Italy and Egypt, now found a new target, the rest of Europe. With his power in France consolidated, Napoleon set out to expand his influence. His military campaigns, which would become legendary, were fueled by both his tactical genius and his unshakable drive to reshape Europe. Napoleon's Grande Armée, as it came to be known, was a force unlike any the world had seen before. Under his leadership, it became an unstoppable juggernaut, sweeping through Europe with lightning speed. From the moment Napoleon set his sights on the continent, he was determined to conquer it piece by piece, bringing it under his control. Napoleon's first series of military campaigns was nothing short of astonishing. In rapid succession, he secured a string of decisive victories that would cement his reputation as one of history's greatest military strategists. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, perhaps his most famous victory, saw Napoleon crush the Russian and Austrian forces in what is regarded as one of the most masterful displays of military tactics in history. His ability to deceive, outmaneuver, and decisively strike when the time was right made him a fearsome opponent. He wasn't simply a commander, he was a master of the battlefield, capable of predicting his enemy's moves and exploiting their weaknesses. Yet Napoleon's military prowess wasn't the only reason for his success. His ability to inspire his troops was unparalleled. The Grande Armée wasn't just a collection of soldiers, it was a united force, driven by loyalty to their leader and belief in his vision. Napoleon led from the front, sharing the hardships of his men and earning their respect and admiration. His soldiers believed in him, and that belief carried them to victory after victory. Napoleon's presence on the battlefield was electrifying. He was a symbol of French strength, and his men would follow him to the ends of the earth. But as his empire expanded, so did the resistance. Coalitions of European powers began to form, determined to curb Napoleon's growing influence. Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, each with its own interests and ambitions, sought to push back against the French advance. What began as a series of battles and wars turned into a prolonged struggle for the fate of Europe. The Napoleonic Wars, as they came to be known, were not just military conflicts but a battle of ideas. As each side sought to control the future of the continent, Napoleon's empire stood as a beacon of revolutionary ideals. But to his enemies, it was a symbol of tyranny that needed to be stopped. Despite the mounting challenges, Napoleon's resolve remained unbroken. He believed that his mission was divinely ordained, that he was the one to lead Europe into a new age. His vision was all-encompassing, stretching beyond military conquest into politics, law, culture, and governance. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in a spectacular ceremony that symbolized both his ambition and his rejection of the old order. By placing the crown on his own head, Napoleon signaled that his power came from himself, not from any divine right or external force. Under his rule, the Napoleonic Empire reached its zenith. From Spain to Russia, from the Netherlands to Italy, Napoleon's empire covered vast stretches of Europe. But with each new conquest came new challenges. The more territory Napoleon controlled, the more resources he needed to maintain it. The pressure on his empire grew, and with it came the inevitable resistance. The constant wars, the drain on resources, and the ever-growing number of enemies began to take their toll. The cracks in Napoleon's empire began to show. The very ambition that had driven him to the heights of power was now pushing him toward a precipice. His relentless expansion had stretched his resources too thin, and the resistance from the coalitions of Europe grew fiercer with each passing year. Napoleon's desire to dominate Europe ultimately led to his downfall. He had created an empire that was too vast to control, an empire built on the foundations of constant warfare and unrelenting ambition. His rise to power had been swift and calculated, but his empire, despite its grandeur, was becoming increasingly unstable. Napoleon's pursuit of greatness, driven by his vision of a new European order, had brought him to the peak of his power, but it would also lead to his eventual decline. The same qualities that made him a legendary figure, his ambition, his genius, and his unyielding drive, would ultimately prove to be his undoing. His empire, which had once seemed invincible, was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own ambition. The stage was set for a dramatic fall, one that would reverberate across Europe for generations to come. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose meteoric rise from a modest Corsican background to the throne of an empire had captivated the world, would make a decision that would forever alter the course of history. The occasion was one of great spectacle, one that would be remembered as the birth of a new era. In the grand, imposing Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. This moment was not just a formality, it was a carefully calculated declaration, a bold statement about power, control, and the nature of his rule. For Napoleon, the coronation was more than an ascent to the throne, it was a rejection of the old ways, a direct challenge to the established norms of Europe. The traditional process of being crowned by the Pope was one of divine sanction, symbolizing that a ruler's power was granted by the Church, by God. But Napoleon, in an act of defiance, took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it upon his own head. The message was clear. His authority was not divinely ordained, nor was it granted by the Church. It was self-made, born from his own ambition, military genius, and the will of the French people. This bold gesture underscored Napoleon's belief that he owed his rise to no one but himself, and that his reign would be shaped by his own vision and ambition. The coronation in 1804 marked the formal birth of the Napoleonic Empire. The transition from first consul to emperor was not just a change in title, it was a definitive shift in the political and cultural landscape of France and of Europe. By crowning himself, Napoleon declared his intention to build a vast empire, an empire that would dominate not just France, but the entire European continent. This was no mere political maneuver. Napoleon had set his sights on far-reaching goals. His reign was to be the pinnacle of French power, and the emperor's crown was a symbol of that unrelenting ambition. He sought to expand the French Empire, to bend Europe to his will, and to impose a new order across the continent. Yet this ambition came with its own set of challenges. The coronation, though grand and symbolically significant, also ignited fear and suspicion among Europe's monarchies. Kings and emperors, entrenched in their centuries-old systems of rule, were deeply unsettled by the rise of a new, powerful force on the European stage. They saw Napoleon not as a liberator or reformer, but as a usurper, a man who threatened to upend the established order. His success in consolidating power in France had already made him a formidable adversary, and his ambition to expand that power beyond French borders stirred deep unease in the monarchies of Europe. For Napoleon, however, these challenges only added fuel to his fire. He was determined to prove that his empire would not only survive but thrive, and he quickly began to take the steps necessary to secure France's dominance. Napoleon's military prowess, which had already been proven time and time again, became the cornerstone of his strategy to secure his empire. He wasted no time in launching a series of military campaigns aimed at expanding France's territory and influence. With his tactical genius, Napoleon led his armies across Europe, defeating one coalition after another. His campaigns in Italy, his decisive victory at Austerlitz, and his campaigns in Prussia and Poland cemented his reputation as a military genius. He was relentless, always pushing forward, always seeking to outmaneuver and outthink his opponents. Each victory built upon the last, and soon Napoleon had transformed France into the most powerful empire in Europe. But while Napoleon's military successes continued to elevate his standing, they also invited fierce opposition. As his empire expanded, neighboring countries began to recognize the threat he posed. Fearing the rise of a powerful French empire at their doorstep, they banded together to try to overthrow him. The coalitions of Europe comprising Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed to resist Napoleon's expansion. These coalitions, though often fractious and divided, represented the growing resistance to Napoleon's rule. The struggle between Napoleon and these coalitions would become one of the defining features of his reign, a series of brutal wars that spanned much of Europe. The challenge Napoleon faced was not simply military. Each coalition against him was not just a battle of arms, but also a battle of wits. Napoleon was forced to contend not just with armies on the battlefield, but with diplomatic maneuvering, shifting alliances, and political intrigue. These were wars that tested not just his military genius, but also his ability to manage alliances and maintain the loyalty of his generals and soldiers. Napoleon's skill as a strategist was undeniable, but his enemies were equally determined to stop him. Despite this, Napoleon's resolve remained unbroken. His determination to expand his empire, to establish French hegemony over Europe, drove him forward, and his army, the Grande Armée, remained one of the most formidable forces in the world. But as Napoleon's military campaigns grew in scope and ambition, so too did the challenges. Each victory on the battlefield brought with it new territories to govern, new people to pacify, and new problems to solve. Napoleon was no mere conqueror. He sought to create an empire that was stable, cohesive, and enduring. He introduced sweeping reforms across the lands he conquered, implementing the Napoleonic Code, which would become the foundation of legal systems in many European countries. His vision for the empire was one of modernity, an empire based not just on military power, but on efficiency, justice, and order. He sought to unify his vast territories under a single legal system, a single currency, and a centralized administration. Napoleon's reforms reshaped Europe, creating a new framework for governance that would influence the continent for years to come. Despite his success, however, the seeds of Napoleon's downfall were already being sown. His unrelenting ambition and his constant military campaigns stretched his resources thin. The French Empire, vast as it was, became increasingly difficult to manage. The demands of maintaining such an empire placed immense pressure on Napoleon's forces and on France's economy. The more he expanded, the more he faced resistance, not just from other European powers, but from within his own empire. The territories he conquered were not always loyal to him, and rebellions in Spain, Portugal, and other regions simmered beneath the surface. While Napoleon's vision for Europe was grand, the practicalities of maintaining such an empire were far more complicated. At home, Napoleon's rule was not without its critics. Though he had won the loyalty of many through his reforms and military successes, there were those who grew wary of his centralization of power. France, which had once been a beacon of revolutionary ideals, was now under the rule of a single man, whose power was absolute. While Napoleon had modernized France, implementing educational reforms, infrastructure projects, and legal systems that would leave a lasting impact, the very concentration of power in his hands led to growing discontent. The sense of freedom that had once accompanied the French Revolution had been replaced by the authoritarian control of an emperor. In many ways, Napoleon had become the very thing that the revolution had sought to overthrow. As Europe continued to resist Napoleon's rule, as the coalitions formed and reformed, Napoleon's grip on power began to falter. The wars of expansion had drained France's resources, and Napoleon's empire, which had seemed invincible, began to show signs of cracking. The ambitious emperor, who had once appeared unstoppable, now faced a series of challenges that threatened the very foundations of his empire. His decision to invade Russia in 1812, one of the most ill-fated campaigns in military history, would mark the beginning of his decline. The Russian campaign, which ended in disaster for Napoleon, shattered the Grande Armée and weakened his position. The loss of his army in Russia, coupled with the growing resistance from Europe's powers, marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. Despite this, Napoleon remained a figure of immense power and charisma. He refused to surrender, even in the face of mounting setbacks. His resilience, his unwavering belief in his destiny, kept him fighting until the very end. But the forces aligned against him were too great, and in 1814, after a series of crushing defeats, he was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. The coronation of Napoleon as emperor in 1804, though a moment of immense personal triumph, was also the beginning of a tumultuous and dramatic period in history. His vision of an empire that would dominate Europe was realized, but it came at a great cost. The same ambition that had propelled him to greatness would eventually lead to his downfall. Napoleon's reign, filled with both glory and tragedy, would become one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of Europe. A story of a man who rose from obscurity to change the world, only to see it all slip away as quickly as it had come. Napoleon Bonaparte's reign, perhaps more than any other period in European history, was defined by war. Between 1803 and 1815, Europe was embroiled in a near-constant state of conflict, with Napoleon at the center of it all. His vision for a French empire, one that would dominate Europe and reshape the world, was pursued relentlessly through a series of wars known as the Napoleonic Wars. These wars were marked by both brilliance and hubris, by dazzling victories that solidified Napoleon's power, and by catastrophic failures that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The early part of Napoleon's reign was a whirlwind of military triumphs. The sheer speed and decisiveness of his victories seemed to confirm the brilliance of his leadership. Napoleon's armies, which he meticulously trained and led with unyielding resolve, were a reflection of his military genius. His command was not just about strategy, it was about inspiring absolute loyalty from his men, creating an army that would follow him to the ends of the earth. With each victory, Napoleon's empire expanded, and so too did his sense of invincibility. One of his greatest early triumphs came at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, a battle that would go down in history as one of his most brilliant victories. Faced with a coalition of Russian and Austrian forces, Napoleon's army was outnumbered, yet he executed one of the most audacious and ingenious strategies of his career. His tactical genius on the battlefield was displayed in full force as he feigned weakness, luring the enemy into a trap. When the time came, Napoleon struck decisively, destroying the Allied forces and securing a victory that shattered the Third Coalition against him. The Battle of Austerlitz cemented Napoleon's position as the dominant military force in Europe. It was a victory so resounding that it sent shockwaves through the continent, and in the wake of it, Napoleon's empire grew even larger. The world was forced to reckon with his power, and Napoleon reveled in his successes, each one further fueling his already towering ego. But with every victory came new challenges. The military campaigns, while brilliant, were costly. The need to maintain such an expansive empire, to keep the vast territories under French control, was draining France's resources. Napoleon's relentless ambition for expansion, his desire to extend French control over Europe, began to stretch his military forces thin. The empire's victories were not without consequence. Napoleon's military genius, while formidable, could not change the simple fact that constant war required constant supplies, reinforcements, and manpower resources that were beginning to run out. The Peninsular War, which began in 1808, marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's unchecked expansion. Spain and Portugal, both under French control, erupted in resistance. Spain, in particular, had been brought under Napoleon's sphere of influence. But the Spanish people, along with the support of Britain, rose up in defiance. The war that ensued, often referred to as the Spanish Ulcer, was a long and protracted struggle that tied down French forces and drained their resources. The Spanish resistance was fierce, fueled by both nationalist sentiment and the support of British troops, who provided vital reinforcements. The Peninsular War became a quagmire for Napoleon, one of the first signs that his military empire, so brilliant in its earlier victories, was facing limits. The war not only drained manpower from the French military, but also exposed the vulnerability of Napoleon's empire. The guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the Spanish, combined with British intervention, created a prolonged conflict that Napoleon could not easily resolve. It was a conflict that showed that his enemies were capable of resilience and that his control over Europe was far from unassailable. The growing resistance was not the only challenge Napoleon faced. In 1812, he embarked on what would become one of the most disastrous military campaigns in history, the invasion of Russia. Napoleon, blinded by his own ambition, believed that the conquest of Russia was the final step in securing his dominance over Europe. With his grand army, one of the largest and most powerful forces ever assembled, he marched eastward, confident of victory. In the early stages of the campaign, Napoleon's forces achieved some successes. However, the Russian winter and the scorched earth tactics employed by the Russian military would prove to be his undoing. As Napoleon's army advanced into Russia, the Russians retreated, burning villages and crops, leaving nothing for the French to sustain themselves. The vastness of Russia, combined with the brutal winter and the scorched earth strategy, decimated Napoleon's forces. The French army, once seemingly invincible, was now trapped in a hostile and unforgiving land. As they reached Moscow, they found the city abandoned and set ablaze. The failure to capture a functional city and the inability to secure supplies signaled the beginning of the end for Napoleon's Russian campaign. The retreat from Moscow became one of the most symbolic moments of Napoleon's downfall. What had begun as an overwhelming show of French power quickly turned into a disaster. The retreat, during which the French army was decimated by starvation, cold, and constant attacks by Russian forces, was a humiliating defeat. Only a fraction of Napoleon's once mighty army made it back to France. The losses suffered in Russia, both in terms of soldiers and morale, were catastrophic. The Russian campaign, which Napoleon had believed would solidify his empire's dominance, instead left it severely weakened. By 1813, the tide had turned decisively against Napoleon. The failure in Russia had emboldened his enemies. The Sixth Coalition, a group of nations including Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden, united to face Napoleon. These coalitions, which had struggled in the past to unite against him, were now more determined than ever to break his power. The Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, was a pivotal moment in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon, once the master of Europe, faced a decisive defeat. The battle, fought from October 16 to 19, 1813, saw Napoleon's forces overwhelmed by the combined might of the coalition forces. The defeat marked the end of Napoleon's control over Central Europe and forced him to retreat to France. His empire, which had once seemed indomitable, was beginning to unravel. By 1814, the Allies had invaded France. Napoleon's power had eroded to the point where even Paris, the heart of his empire, fell. With the city's fall, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The once mighty emperor, who had crowned himself and dreamed of a Europe dominated by French ideals, was exiled to the island of Elba. His reign had ended not in triumph, but in failure, driven by overextension, hubris, and the relentless pursuit of power. However, Napoleon's story was far from over. In 1815, just a year after his exile, he escaped from Elba and returned to France for what would be known as the 100 Days. The French people, disillusioned with the Bourbon Restoration, welcomed him back with open arms. Napoleon, in his characteristic fashion, quickly reclaimed control of France, but the European powers, wary of his return, quickly mobilized against him. The stage was set for one final showdown, the Battle of Waterloo. In June 1815, Napoleon faced a combined British and Prussian force under the command of the Duke of Wellington. The battle was fiercely fought, but Napoleon, who had once seemed invincible, was decisively defeated. His hopes of regaining his empire were dashed, and he was forced to abdicate once again. This time, he was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. where he would spend the final years of his life. The Napoleonic Wars, which had reshaped Europe and altered the course of history, had come to an end. Napoleon's legacy was complex. His military genius, his reforms, and his vision of a united Europe had transformed the continent in ways that still resonate today. However, the wars had also come at a tremendous cost, both in terms of human life and the stability of Europe. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 sought to restore order to the continent, redrawing borders and establishing a new balance of power. Napoleon's fall marked the end of one of the most dramatic and turbulent periods in European history, a time when one man's ambition had brought both glory and devastation to the world. At the zenith of his power, Napoleon Bonaparte's empire stretched across Europe like a vast, undulating wave of French influence, its shores reaching from Spain to Poland. The world he had sought to reshape was now his to command, a testament to his unparalleled military genius and relentless drive for domination. For a time, it seemed as though Napoleon was invincible, his every campaign a resounding success. His influence and authority had no bounds, and the French Empire under his rule was the most formidable force the continent had ever known. The magnitude of his reign cannot be overstated. In the heart of his empire, Napoleon enacted sweeping reforms that would leave a lasting mark on history. One of his most enduring legacies was the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that redefined the principles of law across Europe. The code emphasized civil rights, equality before the law, and the protection of private property, marking a stark departure from the feudal systems that had dominated Europe for centuries. By instituting such progressive reforms, Napoleon sought not only to strengthen his own rule, but to reshape the very fabric of European society. Under his guidance, legal equality and meritocracy became central ideals of governance, with the Napoleonic Code laying the foundation for legal systems around the world. It was a revolutionary departure from the archaic and often arbitrary laws that had governed monarchies and empires before. But Napoleon's rule was not solely about legal reforms. His ambition extended far beyond the realm of law. His governance saw drastic changes in education, finance, and infrastructure, designed to bring order and stability to the fractured European continent. Across his empire, schools and universities flourished under his watch, and the state took a central role in shaping the educational system, ensuring that knowledge could be disseminated to every corner of his vast territory. His financial reforms stabilized the economy, while his infrastructure projects roads, bridges, canals, transformed the very landscape of Europe, making it easier to move goods and troops alike. Under his rule, Europe, which had been splintered by years of warfare, began to experience a brief period of peace and order, with France at the center of it all. For a time, Napoleon's empire seemed a beacon of progress, offering a vision of modernity and stability. Yet, as with all empires, the seeds of decay were already planted. Napoleon's relentless ambition, which had driven him to unimaginable heights, also carried the seeds of his eventual downfall. As his empire grew, so too did the resentment of the nations he had conquered. The conquered peoples, though initially subdued by Napoleon's military genius and administrative reforms, began to chafe under his rule. The sense of nationalism that had been stirred by the French Revolution spread throughout Europe, and many of those living under Napoleon's yoke began to resist. What had once seemed like a dream of unity and peace now felt like a foreign occupation to many. As the years passed, Napoleon's desire to expand his empire beyond the borders of continental Europe only worsened the tensions. He began to stretch his resources thin by invading new territories, seeking to impose his will on nations that were far from subdued. His insistence on controlling Spain, his imposition of his brother Joseph as the King of Spain, and his military campaigns in Portugal and beyond not only alienated his allies, but also sparked widespread revolts and rebellions. The Peninsular War, which began in 1808, became a painful drain on French resources, tying down French troops in a protracted conflict in Spain, a conflict that proved to be as much about national identity and resistance as it was about military conquest. Napoleon's vision of a European empire began to crack, and the political unity he had sought began to disintegrate as the very foundations of his empire were tested by external resistance and internal dissent. The true turning point came in 1812, when Napoleon, in a move that would come to haunt him, launched an invasion of Russia. The decision to march into the vast and unforgiving Russian expanse was an ambitious one, driven by his desire to extend his control and to force Russia into submission. But the campaign was ill-conceived from the start. Napoleon's Grand Army, over 600,000 strong, began the march toward Moscow with the confidence of a leader who had never known defeat. They encountered initial successes, but the Russians, led by Tsar Alexander I, employed the scorched earth tactics that had been so effective in previous conflicts. They burned their crops, destroyed their cities, and left nothing for the French army to sustain itself. The further Napoleon's troops advanced, the more vulnerable they became to starvation, disease, and the relentless Russian winter. As the French army reached Moscow, they found the city in flames, abandoned by the Russians. Napoleon, whose brilliance had always been marked by decisive victories, was now faced with a choice: retreat or continue to chase an elusive victory. He chose to remain, but the longer he stayed in the ruined city, the more disastrous the situation became. Supplies dwindled, morale crumbled, and Russian forces harassed the French at every turn. The retreat from Moscow became one of the most infamous episodes of Napoleon's military career. As his once mighty Grand Army staggered back through the Russian wilderness, it was decimated by cold, hunger, and constant attacks by Russian forces. The retreat marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. The failure in Russia shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility, and his once mighty army was reduced to a fraction of its original size. The ramifications of the Russian campaign were far-reaching. As news of the catastrophic defeat spread across Europe, the long-oppressed nations began to see an opportunity. The coalition of Europe, which had been hesitant to challenge Napoleon's might, now united in opposition to him. The Sixth Coalition, composed of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Austria, banded together with one singular goal: to dismantle Napoleon's empire. Battles erupted across Europe as the French Empire, once so expansive and untouchable, faced the combined might of Europe's great powers. In 1813, Napoleon suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, where his forces were outnumbered and overwhelmed by the coalition forces. This loss marked a decisive turning point in the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon was forced to retreat, his empire crumbling beneath him. By 1814, the writing was on the wall. The coalition forces advanced toward France, and Paris fell. Napoleon, facing the inevitable, was forced to abdicate. The emperor, who had once crowned himself in a show of defiance, now found himself deposed and exiled to the small island of Elba. The grand ambitions that had propelled him to the height of glory had now led to his dramatic downfall. But Napoleon's story did not end there. In 1815, he managed to escape from Elba and returned to France for what would become known as the 100 Days. In a final attempt to reclaim his throne, Napoleon rallied his supporters and gathered an army. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he might defy the odds once again, but the world had changed. The European powers, now united against him, quickly mobilized. The decisive battle would come at Waterloo, where Napoleon faced the combined forces of Britain and Prussia. Despite a brilliant initial strategy, Napoleon's forces were ultimately defeated. The defeat at Waterloo was the final blow to his empire and his reign. Once again, he was exiled, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There, far from the power he once wielded, Napoleon spent the remainder of his life reflecting on the rise and fall of his empire. Napoleon Bonaparte's life was one of unimaginable highs and devastating lows. At the height of his glory, he controlled much of Europe and had reshaped the political landscape of the continent. His military genius, his ambition, and his reforms left a lasting legacy. Yet, the very qualities that made him great, his boundless ambition, his desire for power, and his belief in his own destiny, were also what led to his ultimate downfall. His empire, like all great empires before it, collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Napoleon's life, filled with moments of brilliance and moments of hubris, remains a testament to the fleeting nature of glory and the complexities of power. Though his empire has long since crumbled, his influence continues to shape the world in profound ways, ensuring that his name will forever be etched in the annals of history. The year 1812 marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor who had once seemed invincible. His ambitious plans for European dominance had pushed him to the very peak of power, but the decision to invade Russia would ultimately unravel everything he had fought for. The Russian campaign, which he hoped would be the final blow to his enemies, turned into one of the most disastrous military endeavors in history. Napoleon had been on an undefeated streak for years, his empire stretching from Spain to Poland, his military genius unquestioned. Yet, as his ambitions grew, so did the challenges of maintaining such a vast empire. His desire to extend French control further east, particularly over Russia, led him to believe that defeating Tsar Alexander I would cement his rule across Europe. It was a decision driven by the same overconfidence that had propelled him to greatness but would also be his undoing. The campaign began in the summer of 1812 with the assembly of the Grand Army, a force of over 600,000 men, one of the largest military assemblies ever seen. Napoleon led them with his usual flair, moving swiftly across Europe, crossing the border into Russia with the confidence that victory would be just another chapter in his long list of triumph. However, from the moment the French troops crossed into Russian territory, the campaign began to face obstacles that even Napoleon could not have anticipated. The Russians, under Tsar Alexander, adopted a strategy of retreat and scorched earth. As Napoleon advanced, the Russian army refused to engage in a major battle, drawing Napoleon deeper into their vast country, farther from the supply lines and reinforcements that had made his past campaigns so successful. The Russian forces burned everything in their path: villages, crops and towns, leaving nothing for Napoleon's army to sustain itself on. The further his forces marched into Russia, the more strained they became. The French soldiers, unprepared for the harsh conditions, began to suffer from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The ever-approaching Russian winter was a constant, looming threat that no amount of military prowess could conquer. Napoleon pressed on, believing that once he reached Moscow, the Russian capital, he would force Tsar Alexander into submission. But when he finally reached Moscow, he found it abandoned and burning, the city engulfed in flames. The Russians had used the same scorched earth tactics in the city, leaving Napoleon with nothing to claim but a ruined, desolate capital. There was no surrender, no negotiated peace, just empty streets and the bitter realization that his campaign had failed. With no supplies, no prospects of further engagement, and no possibility of securing a victory, Napoleon was forced to make a desperate decision: retreat. The retreat from Moscow was a catastrophe that became a symbol of Napoleon's downfall. The once mighty Grand Army, composed of veterans and elite soldiers, began to disintegrate. The bitter Russian winter descended upon the troops, and the effects were devastating. Soldiers froze to death in the snow, others succumbed to disease, while the remnants of the Russian army harassed Napoleon's retreating forces. The campaign that had begun with such promise ended in humiliation. By the time the French forces crossed back into Poland, fewer than 100,000 men remained. The failure in Russia sent shockwaves across Europe. Napoleon's once unquestioned supremacy was now in question. His enemies, long wary of his power but too divided to act, suddenly saw an opening. The Sixth Coalition was formed in response, a unified front that included Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden. These nations, along with several others, now saw the possibility of ending Napoleon's reign and restoring the old order in Europe. The collapse of Napoleon's Grand Army was not just a military failure. It was a sign that his empire was vulnerable, that the man who had once conquered Europe could now be undone by a single disastrous campaign. The defeat in Russia had left Napoleon vulnerable, but it also revealed the unshakable resilience of his enemies. As the coalition forces gathered, battles raged across Europe. The result was inevitable. In 1813, Napoleon was decisively beaten at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. This was the first major defeat that Napoleon had suffered in nearly a decade. The battle was a brutal clash of armies, and it ended with Napoleon's forces being overwhelmed by the combined might of the coalition. It was clear to everyone, including Napoleon, that the end was near. His empire, which had seemed invincible for so long, was now crumbling under the pressure of constant warfare, dwindling resources, and mounting resistance. In 1814, the coalition finally reached Paris. Napoleon's defenders, exhausted and demoralized, could no longer hold the city. On the 6th of April, 1814, facing inevitable defeat, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne of France. His reign, which had been marked by military brilliance and unyielding ambition, came to an abrupt end. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed, and Napoleon was exiled to the small island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. His empire, once a sprawling force that controlled much of Europe, was reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. The man who had crowned himself Emperor of the French was now a prisoner of his own ambition. Yet Napoleon's story did not end with his exile to Elba. Elba, despite its isolation and small size, could not contain the restless energy of a man who had once ruled an empire. Napoleon's spirit was not broken. The ambition that had fueled his rise to power was still very much alive. In March 1815, less than a year after his exile, Napoleon managed to escape from Elba. With the help of a small band of loyal followers, he returned to France, determined to reclaim his throne. Napoleon's return was met with surprising enthusiasm from the French people. Despite his fall from power, many still saw him as the leader who had brought stability to France and who had given them a sense of pride. He rallied troops to his cause, quickly gathering an army to march on Paris. The monarchy that had been restored under Louis XVIII was weak, and the French population, weary of uncertainty, welcomed Napoleon back as their rightful ruler. This brief period of renewed power would come to be known as the 100 Days. Napoleon's return sent shockwaves across Europe. The monarchs of the continent, who had been relieved to see him exiled, now faced the possibility of his return to power. They were quick to act. The Seventh Coalition was formed, including Britain, Prussia, Austria, and the Netherlands, among others, united in their resolve to stop Napoleon once and for all. The stage was set for another epic confrontation, one that would determine the future of Europe. The decisive battle would take place at Waterloo, in present-day Belgium, on the 18th of June, 1815. Napoleon, despite his tactical brilliance, could not overcome the combined might of the British and Prussian forces. The battle was a fierce, bloodied struggle, with Napoleon's forces initially gaining ground but ultimately being outflanked and overwhelmed. The British, led by the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians, commanded by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, combined their forces to deliver a crushing blow. Napoleon's military genius, which had once seemed infallible, was now rendered irrelevant by the sheer numbers and coordination of his enemies. As the day wore on and the tide of battle turned, Napoleon was forced to watch as his hopes of reclaiming his empire faded. The defeat at Waterloo was complete and decisive. Napoleon was captured, and his fate was sealed. This time, there would be no escape, no return to power. He was exiled once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, far from the continent he had once ruled. Napoleon spent his final years on St. Helena, reflecting on the rise and fall of his extraordinary life. In his isolation, far from the glories of empire, he contemplated his legacy, both the triumphs and the tragedies of his reign. Though his empire had crumbled, his influence on history remained undeniable. Napoleon's ambition, his genius, and his undeniable impact on the course of European history would continue to resonate for generations to come. His story was one of immense power, sweeping changes, and the inexorable fall that came when ambition collided with the limits of reality. In the end, Napoleon Bonaparte's life was a testament to the fleeting nature of glory and the complexities of human ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte's final years, far removed from the grandeur of the imperial courts and battlefields where he had once commanded empires, were marked by a striking solitude that belied the power and authority he had once wielded. His exile to the island of Elba had been but a brief chapter in the saga of his life, an interlude in his unyielding quest for glory. But in 1815, defying expectations and escaping the confines of his island prison, Napoleon made a dramatic return to France for what became known as the 100 Days. The world had not yet seen the last of Napoleon. His return to France was a spectacular revival of his influence, a flash of the old power and charisma that had once swept through Europe. The people of France, weary of the Bourbon monarchy and the uncertainty that followed Napoleon's fall, welcomed him back as a hero. His old soldiers, still loyal to the man who had led them to victory after victory, rallied to his side. With the French people's support, Napoleon quickly regained control of the government, ousting Louis XVIII and re-establishing himself as Emperor of the French. For a brief time, it seemed as though Napoleon's empire might rise again. The excitement of his return spread through France, reigniting the fervor that had once made him a symbol of French strength and ambition. Yet, despite the passionate support from his soldiers and the general public, the path to lasting power was fraught with obstacles. The monarchies of Europe, never willing to tolerate a renewed Napoleonic threat, quickly formed the Seventh Coalition, a powerful alliance determined to destroy him once and for all. The stage was set for the final confrontation, the Battle of Waterloo. On the 18th of June, 1815, Napoleon faced his destiny. The battle, fought near the small village of Waterloo in modern-day Belgium, would prove to be his undoing. Napoleon, despite his strategic brilliance and the fierce loyalty of his troops, was overwhelmed by the combined forces of Britain, led by the Duke of Wellington, and Prussia, commanded by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Despite his tactical skill, the outcome of the battle was never truly in doubt, as the strength of the coalition armies proved insurmountable. As the day wore on, the tide turned against Napoleon. The once indomitable emperor, whose victories had reshaped Europe, now found himself defeated, his army broken and retreating. The Battle of Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's reign. His dreams of empire, once so vivid, were shattered. For the second time in his life, he was forced to surrender. Napoleon was captured by the British and exiled once again, this time to the isolated island of St. Helena, a remote outpost in the South Atlantic Ocean. The emperor, who had once commanded the hearts and minds of Europe, now found himself at the mercy of his captors, alone in a desolate land far from the empire he had built. St. Helena, a tiny island with rugged terrain and a harsh climate, became Napoleon's final home. The contrast between the grandeur of his past and the isolation of his present could not have been starker. For the once mighty ruler, the daily routines of life on St. Helena were a far cry from the battlefield triumphs in imperial palaces he had known. Yet, even in this distant exile, Napoleon's mind remained sharp, his ambition undimmed. He spent his days in relative solitude, reflecting on his past, dictating memoirs, and corresponding with friends and family, attempting to shape the narrative of his life and legacy. Though he was far from the world that had once revered him, Napoleon remained a figure of fascination, his thoughts and writings still able to capture the imaginations of those beyond the island's shores. In his letters and reflections, Napoleon often pondered his past victories and mistakes, but he also considered the future of Europe, speculating on the balance of power and the rise of new nations. His thoughts on politics and governance, though shaped by his experiences as an emperor, were still keenly attuned to the political dynamics of the world he had left behind. In many ways, he foresaw the political shifts that would define the 19th century. He spoke of the decline of monarchies, the rise of republics, and the enduring influence of revolutionary ideas. Despite his fall from power, Napoleon continued to believe in the ideals of the French Revolution, and he viewed his life and career as a testament to the possibility of change no matter how fleeting that change might be. Napoleon's physical health, however, was in decline. The island's harsh climate took its toll, and his years of living in relative isolation began to erode his strength. His once vibrant health, which had allowed him to command armies and move at the speed of a conqueror, was no longer a source of pride. He suffered from a variety of ailments, but it was his declining health, coupled with the isolation and despair of his situation, that wore him down in his final years. Visitors to the island, though few, were struck by the contrast between the man they had imagined and the man before them. The emperor, whose presence had once been enough to inspire armies, now lived in quiet reflection, his dignity and intellect the only remnants of his former self. Despite the hardships of his exile, Napoleon retained a sense of control, a flicker of the commanding presence that had once defined him. Even in his final years, he was not the broken man his captors may have hoped for. His charisma, though less radiant, still shone through. He maintained a connection to the outside world, keeping up correspondence with former allies and adversaries alike. Though his direct influence had been reduced to nothing, his presence remained a powerful symbol for those who still revered him as a leader of vision and ambition. But as his health continued to deteriorate, the end of his life became inevitable. Napoleon's thoughts turned to the legacy he would leave behind. In the solitude of St. Helena, he reflected on the empire he had built and lost, on the ambition that had driven him to reshape Europe and ultimately led to his downfall. The dream of an empire that would span continents had slipped through his fingers, but in his mind, the grandeur of his reign lived on, preserved in the pages of his memoirs and in the minds of those who still believed in his vision. Napoleon remained convinced that history would ultimately remember him not for his defeat, but for his audacity, his unyielding determination, and his drive to change the world. On the 5th of May, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena, far from the empire he had once ruled, surrounded by a handful of loyal followers and a dwindling world that had long since moved on from his imperial ambitions. His death marked the end of an era, a dramatic conclusion to a life defined by power, triumph, and tragedy. But while his body was laid to rest on that remote island, Napoleon's legacy endured. His influence on the course of European history could not be undone. The Napoleonic Wars had redrawn the map of Europe, and the Napoleonic Code would continue to shape legal systems across the world. In death, as in life, Napoleon remained a figure of contradiction. To some, he was a hero who had brought about much-needed reform and had tried to reshape Europe for the better. To others, he was a tyrant who had brought unnecessary wars and suffering to millions. He was both admired and reviled, a man whose life inspired passion in all who encountered it. His story is a testament to the fragility of power and the fleeting nature of glory. Yet, it is also a reminder of the indomitable spirit of one man who dared to dream bigger than the world he inhabited, whose ambition changed the course of history, and whose name, despite his fall from grace, would forever echo through the halls of time. Napoleon Bonaparte died on the 5th of May, 1821, in exile on the remote island of St. Helena. Far from the empire he had once ruled, the grandeur of his reign, once stretching across much of Europe, had crumbled, and with it, the vast power he had commanded. Yet, despite the catastrophic end to his empire, Napoleon's legacy lived on, enduring in ways that would echo through the centuries. His name became synonymous with ambition, genius, and tragedy, a paradox of a man who, at his height, had seemed invincible, but whose relentless ambition ultimately led to his downfall. Napoleon's story, filled with extraordinary highs and devastating lows, continues to captivate the world. From his humble beginnings on the island of Corsica to becoming the ruler of much of Europe, his rise was nothing short of meteoric. A military genius, a master tactician, and a man of boundless energy and drive, Napoleon changed the course of history in ways few leaders ever have. His empire may have fallen, but the reverberations of his reign continue to shape the world today. As history has shown, Napoleon's legacy is as complex as the man himself. His military strategies, which had brought him victory after victory in battles across Europe, are still studied in military academies around the world. His brilliant tactics, from the innovative use of artillery to his daring maneuvering on the battlefield, turned the French army into a feared and respected force. His ability to inspire loyalty and devotion among his soldiers was unparalleled, and many historians and military experts argue that it was this combination of genius and charisma that allowed him to lead an army that seemed unstoppable. But Napoleon's influence was not confined to the battlefield. One of his most enduring contributions is the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that fundamentally altered the course of legal systems across the globe. By standardizing laws across his empire, Napoleon created a system that emphasized equality before the law, the protection of civil rights, and the sanctity of property. The Napoleonic Code became the foundation for modern legal systems in many countries, serving as a model for legal reforms worldwide. Its impact is still felt today, a testament to the foresight and pragmatism of Napoleon's reforms. In a world previously governed by a patchwork of feudal and archaic laws, the Napoleonic Code was a revolutionary step forward, ensuring the rights of individuals and establishing a system of governance based on merit rather than privilege. Napoleon's reforms extended beyond law into education, infrastructure, and the organization of government. His centralized approach to administration, the creation of the Bank of France, and the introduction of a uniform system of weights and measures helped to stabilize France after the chaos of the Revolution. Through these reforms, Napoleon not only solidified his rule, but also left a lasting mark on France and Europe. Yet, for all his successes in governance, Napoleon's ambitions were not without their costs. The human toll of Napoleon's wars is a dark chapter of his legacy. His conquests, which seemed to offer a vision of a united Europe under a single, strong leader, resulted in immense suffering. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged from 1803 to 1815, led to the deaths of millions and caused widespread destruction. Entire generations of men were lost in the carnage, and the economies of many European nations were shattered. For all the reforms he implemented, Napoleon's wars left a legacy of bitterness and loss, creating scars that would take decades to heal. For many, Napoleon was both a hero and a tyrant, a man whose genius was matched only by the destruction his ambition wrought. The wars he waged altered the political landscape of Europe, forever changing the balance of power. When Napoleon's empire finally crumbled, it was replaced by a Europe united against his ideas. The Congress of Vienna, which sought to restore the old monarchies after his defeat, was shaped by the very forces that had once rallied against Napoleon. His vision of a unified Europe was ultimately rejected, and the borders of Europe were redrawn. But the ideas he had championed, liberty, equality, fraternity, continued to influence European politics for generations. Culturally, Napoleon's influence is equally profound. His life and legacy have inspired countless works of art, literature, and music. His story has been immortalized in grand canvases by artists like Jacques-Louis David, who captured the emperor in all his imperial glory, and in the pages of Tolstoy's War and Peace, where Napoleon looms large as both a symbol of revolutionary change and a tragic figure consumed by his own ambition. The fascination with Napoleon extends beyond history books. His life has been portrayed in film, theater, and even opera. He remains a subject of intense interest. His image as a conqueror, reformer, and visionary, providing endless material for artists and thinkers to explore. But for all his achievements, Napoleon's legacy is also steeped in controversy. Was he a hero who brought reform and stability to Europe? Or was he a tyrant, a conqueror driven by an insatiable lust for power? The debate over his true nature is as heated today as it was during his lifetime. Some view him as a man ahead of his time, a visionary who sought to reshape Europe for the better. Others see him as a dangerous megalomaniac, whose wars and ambitions brought untold suffering to millions. Napoleon's image has shifted over the years, often reflecting the political climate of the time. To some, he remains a symbol of revolutionary change, a leader who gave the common man a voice. To others, he is a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition and hubris. Yet, despite the differing opinions on his legacy, there is no denying that Napoleon's impact on European and world history is immeasurable. His life is a study in contradictions, a man of extraordinary vision and ruthless determination, whose triumphs were matched only by the destruction they caused. He reshaped the political and legal landscapes of Europe, but at a great cost. His conquests left a world scarred by war. Yet his ideas about governance, law, and the rights of individuals laid the groundwork for much of modern European thought. Even in death, Napoleon's story continued to fascinate the world. The mysteries surrounding his final years on St. Helena, the reports of his declining health, and the rumors about his final words and thoughts only added to the mythos that had already built up around him. His exiled existence became part of the legend, an emperor broken by his own ambition, but still holding on to his vision of glory and power. Today, his tomb in Paris, at Les Invalides, remains one of the most visited sites in France, drawing thousands of people each year who come to pay homage to the man who once held the fate of Europe in his hand. Napoleon's legacy is a tapestry woven from threads of both admiration and criticism, brilliance and folly. His rise from a minor noble on a small Mediterranean island to the ruler of much of Europe is a story of extraordinary ambition, and it is a story that continues to inspire those who dare to dream of greatness. But his fall, as much as his rise, serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the fleeting nature of glory. His military genius and revolutionary reforms left a profound impact on the world, but the human cost of his ambition was immense. Napoleon, a man who sought to reshape the world in his own image, remains one of the most fascinating, complex, and controversial figures in history. His legacy, still debated and dissected, will continue to be studied for generations to come. What is certain is that the world Napoleon left behind was forever altered by his presence, and his name will live on as both a symbol of human potential and a cautionary tale of ambition taken to its extreme. Ultimately, Napoleon's story serves as a poignant reminder of the dual-edged nature of power and ambition. His life invites us to reflect on the balance between visionary leadership and the ethical responsibilities that accompany such influence, urging a deeper understanding of the impact one individual's dreams can have on the world. Like, comment, and subscribe for more captivating stories from history. Join us next time as we explore another tale of greatness, ambition, and the human spirit. See you soon.